All right, so today I'm here with Dr. Ian M. Cook, editor-in-chief of AllegraLab, author of Scholarly Podcasting, Why, What, and How, newly released Podcaster Parish, a collaboration with Laurie Beckstead and Hannah McGregor. I finally got the book. Tell me more about yourself.
Oh wow! What do you want to know?
Anything.
Why am I here? Why? So this is actually an accident. The reason why I ended up making two books on podcasts. So actually, for a day job for many years, I used to be the director of something called Olive, which is the Open Learning Initiative, which is a program for displaced learners in Budapest. And the very start, when I started working on that initiative, when I was actually just a volunteer teacher, together with another colleague, we started interviewing guest lecturers who would come to the class to speak to our students, who at the time, like in Budapest, it was very politically charged, the question around refugees. And we used to have this refugee program. And then people coming afterwards, then the students started to interview the lecturers, and we put them out as a podcast. And I really liked the idea. And I wrote a very short article about it for Times Higher Education. And then the commission's editor for Routledge got in touch and said, "Oh, do you want to write a book on scholarly podcasting? No one has one." I said, "Okay, let's see what it's like." And then and then I started looking into it a bit more seriously as a research thing, and I ended up interviewing 101 people who were making podcasts, 101 scholars who were making podcasts for that first book. And so, really, I'm not a media studies scholar, or I became one by accident, maybe. Really, like my training, I'm a social anthropologist who works a lot on urban stuff. So like I did a lot of research in India in a small city there called Mangaluru. So this like I don't know, like when you have to introduce yourself, and you at meetings and so on, I never know how to introduce myself. Like as a practitioner, really, I work on access to education for displaced people. As a researcher, really, I'm an urban anthropologist, but somehow accidentally I ended up doing all this stuff on podcasting, which I really like, because people, it's a new field, and in a new field, people are just really excited. There's not very much gatekeeping. There's just lots of people who are like, yeah, everyone should research podcasting because podcasting is it's really interesting, and no one's researching it, and there's only a very few
I
people doing
know.
it. So it's great that you're
Yeah.
you're pursuing it as well, because I think exactly it's a little bit different when you're my age. Not that I'm old, I'm only 41, but like I'm not a student anymore, and like I'm just busy with other stuff. I can't dedicate my time to it the same way like a master student can. So it's really good that you're doing this. So yeah, that's me. I am English. Maybe people can tell from listening, but I'm based in Budapest, Hungary, for the last 14 years.
Thank you so much. Yes, I read your book, Scholarly Podcasting. It was very insightful. I'm like, oh, this is great. This is like what I want. Because I feel like you said, there isn't many scholars looking into that deeply. Yes, maybe they might be using it, but just for like a project, and then they move on, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And a lot of them focus on the dissemination portion. It's all just about let's amplify our research. Let's look, it's the end goal. Whereas I'm looking at it at a knowledge mobilization perspective in terms of the production, the co-creation, the translation, synthesis. Like, so you can show your research at different phases of your progress, a little spotlight through podcasting, or you can
Mm-hmm.
use it for data analysis, collecting your data, voices as data. So in my previous conversations, I've touched on some of your work about how podcasts can mobilize a community for social change and your critique of podcasting as an anthropological method. So here you know how some scholars have a difficult time accepting the use of unscholarly forms of analysis. Can you elaborate on that?
Unscholarly forms of analysis.
Yeah, so in terms of if you are using it as a method,
Mm-hmm.
they don't take
Yeah,
it seriously.
take it seriously, because I think sometimes there's some healthy skepticism around things that are new. Like I think always we've got to be wary of that a little bit. I think like as scholars, because just because something is new and has a lot of buzz around it doesn't mean we should just jump on it. So we are going to use podcast as a method, and I think we should, and we can talk about that as well. But then we have to make sure we do it in a way where we critique it in a way that makes it useful, which is what I tried to do with this article, critique of podcasting as an anthropological method, because I think there's a tendency to say, okay, wow, we can actually interview people and put their voice out there, and isn't that great? Look how authentic, etc., and so on. But in anthropology, we've been critiquing the idea of creating authority and legitimacy through writing for a very long time. Since at least the 1980s in anthropology, we've been aware of the role of the ethnographer in creating their own authority and having a certain voice, and what this certain voice does vis-a-vis the relationship one has with their interlocutors.
I see this term everywhere in my readings, and I felt like it's necessary to have a definition. So here we go. Here's the definition. Interlocutor, a person involved in a conversation or dialogue. A conversation partner, a middleman who speaks on behalf of an organization.
Yes, it's great that we can put the voices out there of the people we interview, but if we do so, we have to take into account, yes, it might be a performance. Yes, we are still the people that are controlling the space. We're going to edit to some degree, and even editing that maybe people aren't aware of, like changing, some EQ settings or a bit of compression can just make a big difference somehow subconsciously in many people. So all of these things we have to be aware of as we do it. And I think people don't take it seriously because they don't know what it is. And I think what we can do, those of us who are invested in using podcasting as a method, is to start to push to make it be taken more seriously by critiquing it and taking it seriously as a method, which is why it's great you have this project. The second book you mentioned, the Podcast or Perish with Hannah and Laurie, we try to look at peer review, like how to peer review a podcast. That's another way to get people to take it seriously. And one of the things we say in that, and I think I've probably then said it elsewhere, is that you do get a resistance because a lot of people just think if it's not written down, it's not serious. If it's not text-based, that it's not serious, which doesn't really make any sense, because if you look back at the history of knowledge production, is only very recently in the history of humankind that we've really been taken by text as the way of passing on knowledge, and especially nowadays that people are just producing far too many papers. Like researchers are just churning out papers. They do a bit of research and they write 5, 6, 7, 8 papers on the topic because that's what they need to do to get a job and get promotion, because everything's very metricized. And all of this means that I realize I'm giving you a rambling answer here, but means that we have to find ways that escape, at least to build our own ways of producing knowledge that escape or elide or push back against this. And I think podcasting can be one way of doing this if it gets taken more seriously, which would mean having transcripts, getting it peer reviewed, critiquing the ways in which the voice and authority and positionality and all these things play out through the things that we produce.
Yes, definitely. I agree 100%. Speaking towards the voices as legit data evidence, with looking at the critical podcasting methodology, it is a framework which focuses on the dialogue. So one of the sub-themes of voices, counter narratives, it involves listening, sharing lived experiences, shedding awareness, challenging those oppressive hierarchies, and building relationships of trust. So it's more about that infrastructure, building relations, and not just jumping in to the research and leaving. It's a continuous activity, and it's all for social impact. So your research again with the podcast Online Gods, Digital Cultures in India and Beyond. Can you tell us more about the research and the process in terms of podcast applications? So here I see that it could be used as a methodology approach and as a tool because you disseminated it through podcast. But tell us more about that.
That was a research project led by Sahana Udupa at LMU in Munich. And it was broadly about online hate and politics and religious identity in India. And so she approached me because I'd interviewed her for another podcast that I was doing a long time ago, New Books in South Asian Studies. And she said, I have this new project. It would be nice to have a podcast. And I think it's fine to say this because maybe she'll never listen, but even if she does, I'm sure she'll say it's fair. She was more interested in the first half of the podcast, which was interviewing scholars like interviewing media scholars. But I found it much more interesting the second half of the podcast, because the first half we interviewed a scholar about a topic or a concept, and the second half we found what we called online gods, which was just a way to sort of get attention. But it sort of worked, because then we would find people who were influential or important actors in the digital sphere in South Asia or in India, really, and then interviewed them. And sometimes controversially, like people didn't like. I mean, I interviewed like this right-wing Twitter superstar, is what we called him, because he's like, he's massive. His tweets get however many hundreds of thousands of whatever. I don't know now, because Twitter's of course gone completely mad. But back then, he's followed by the Prime Minister of India, and so on. And like so like interview people like him, but then also interview people who broke the Me Too India scandal at the time. It was a comedian, and about some other comedians, and this was also of course done through Twitter. So we explored questions of scandal and so on, or people who ran India's first gay online magazine, like different sort of people who were doing interesting stuff online in different ways. And it was nice because, of course, if you were doing it as and of course there's limitations, right? Because if you were doing it as a pure research, non-podcast type, you wouldn't like jump around so much as what we did, like like with lots of different people all the time, because partly you're interested in getting some sort of listenership there, and a listener doesn't want to listen to you interview like 20 right-wing Twitter guys week after week. Maybe they do, but like at least that wasn't what we were going for. So instead we jumped around a lot. So I think in terms of the data that was gathered, I think there is something interesting there in terms of people speaking about digital media. And of course I'm interviewing people through digital media to have them tell us about digital media. So it was sort of interesting. And some people would not, I don't think, have agreed to an interview if it wasn't a podcast. Like, so one of the content creators, I can't remember her name right now, but she like makes these funny YouTube videos and stuff, and often around women's issues, like for example around sanitary products, or wearing a hijab because she thinks she's Muslim but doesn't wear one, and like stuff like this. She would make these sort of funny videos, and like actually when I started to interview her, she was just like no response, nothing, just like whatever, just like in the pre-chat. And then I said, all right, I'm going to start recording now. And I was thinking in my head, probably this is not going to be put in the podcast because like it's not going to be any use. And as soon as I pressed record, she came alive, like ta-da, and like started.
Oh, no way. Yeah. That's awesome.
And then it was like this proper chatty, like like full of beans. And then it finished, and then she went back to, okay, yeah, bye, and then left. That's awesome. So of course, people like this, they're using it also for their own promotion, which of course you have to be aware of when you analyze the data. But yes, but I think it's also touching on some of the things you mentioned in the methodology that you want to look at is you have to remember that when we are doing research as social scientists, we're asking people for their time very often. And what do people get back out of that? Nothing directly very often. And I think in anthropology, especially, we've had a tendency to sort of fill the suffering slot, if like to look at people in quite marginalized people who are suffering to various degrees, and like, then asking people who are extremely busy and having sometimes difficult times to sit down with us for a few hours to tell us about their life. Like, it's different once you start to then actually give people something concrete afterwards that they can see that they're part of something, not, and of course there's lots to be said. And for many cases, it will still remain that the primary way of gathering data is to do stuff anonymously, to anonymize the place and so on and so forth, when you want to allow people to explore certain things. But sometimes for some people at certain moments, they would rather be heard, because this is also part of it as well. And I think that's really, really interesting as well and again, not to celebrate it or romanticize it, because there are lots of questions there about who we choose and how we put them out there and our role as the expert and so on and so forth. But I think also actually in the first book, I interviewed a lady there based in, I want to say Sweden, but anyway, somewhere in Northern Europe. And she interviewed like environmental activists who are like making their own sort of eco communities and this sort of stuff. And she said that people were really up for being on her podcast, but not for talking, because they also wanted to tell people about their way of life and their ideas, etc., and so on. So I think there is a feeling that, if we're going to be researching amongst people, then we should also find ways of giving back in a way which is meaningful. Because with the best one in the world, no one's going to read our books or our journal articles or your MA dissertation, right? Like because it's firstly it's written in a language which is very difficult to understand because we use whatever the jargon that's needed for whatever discipline we're in. Also, very often it's behind paywalls. And also, it takes a lot of time. Like to read a book is a big undertaking on like a scholarly book. But people might listen to 45 minutes of an interview that you make, especially if it's about the people about your own community, right? So that can also be an interesting way, and it allows people then to critique and send stuff back. So this podcast, I don't know if you saw it, the Brazilian one, Munderu or something like this. It's in the scholarly podcasting book, but by a Brazilian anthropologist, and she's brilliant because I can't listen to it because I don't speak Portuguese, but she would get anthropologists and sit them down together with their interlocutors, and then have the anthropologist explain the research, and then have the interlocutor respond to it. And it's brilliant. It's a really good way of like starting new cycles of knowledge production, also of messing with the hierarchies of who is who's the expert and who's not. Because she said sometimes the interlocutor would be saying to the anthropologist, what, really? That's what you got?
Yeah.
And that's really, really nice. It really does interesting things in terms of destabilizing the hierarchies that exist between the researcher and those we research amongst. I'm giving you really rambling answers.
I know. They're great answers.
Because I just rushed in, sat down, turned on the thing. So yeah.
No worries. It's bright. It's early this morning. You're saying a lot of, at least for me, it is over here.
It's early for you. Yeah, it's afternoon for me.
Yeah. No, but your answers are fantastic. It's actually pulling out the data collaboratively. So you're critiquing the data together in a sense. And publicly, like if you are making a podcast and you're going to put it on Spotify, there's several people that can critique it. It is in a form, we are using podcasts as a method of sharing knowledge, dissecting it in any which way, depending on perspectives, I guess. Some good, some bad. But again, it's good. Everyone's voice should be heard.
Yeah. And especially because you have this serial nature and things going over time, that you can build a community of listeners.
So applying this whole idea into higher education. So again, we went over the dissemination as the final deliverable, but what about the rest? So we were talking about the knowledge translation, synthesis. How can we incorporate podcast multimodality in translating a particular theory or in a course, or synthesizing secondary, primary research?
Sure. So I'll just tell you about a bunch of things where I see people doing interesting things which speak to your question. So one is, and these are all people I interviewed, right? But one is this. What was the podcast called? Fully Automated. And in that, when I interviewed the creator of that, and I think his name is Nicholas Kernzy. I mean, it was 2 or 3 years ago, so I apologize if I get this wrong. But he was saying that he would be interviewing. He was basically writing a book about these different arguments and debates within the left, right? Within left-wing political theorists, and so be interviewing people for that. You have to really dig into their work and in the phrasing of the questions, and then in doing the interview, and then afterwards in the editing process. Because they'd often talk for a few hours and cut it down to much shorter. He said that was like a real good process for thinking things through and working things out. So in that sense, when it comes to theory, for sure. Secondly, I think there's also people who were telling me, they have an idea, something that's maybe interesting, but they're not quite sure, but they have a podcast. This was like the State of the Theory podcasters who I spoke to, and they were saying, so it would be good just to talk it out loud and actually speaking things through when a mic is there and it's going to be recorded and put out into the world is a really good way of crystallizing your thoughts, testing out ideas. Maybe those ideas become an article or a chapter or whatever, and maybe they don't. But the whole process of working stuff out is there as well in talking things through. And then I think, the same way that if I go out and I do research, amongst rickshaw drivers in India, and I have all my interviews and I go home and I, go through and I start to analyze them, maybe I use different codes, whatever. It's not when you start to edit, like again, because you're listening to things over and over, like in the process of just editing someone's words, I'm very often you're not really cutting stuff out, but you still listen to the whole thing and seeing, oh, maybe that question I don't need, or the answer to that question I don't need, or whatever. And then there as well, that would be a moment where you can start to do the analysis as well. It's like sort of the first level analysis. So I think you can actually build in podcasting to existing things that we're doing anyway, because anyway we're discussing ideas with our colleagues about working stuff out, anyway we're reading stuff and synthesizing it, trying to work out what our theoretical contribution is. Anyway, we're going to be, if we're working in the social sciences and we work with people and we're interviewing them, anyway, we're going to be analyzing what they've told us, etc. So on. So there's loads of opportunities to do that in the right circumstances. Yeah, and it's not used so much, but more and more people are trying stuff. Yeah.
A lot of courses in communications, they're trying to incorporate podcasts with some assignments for students, and even just as materials, like as an alternative method of hearing about theory. But I still feel there's barriers to podcast use with academics. With my past interviews, there was some intimidation in regards to the technology or training required. They think it needs to be perfect. They're like, oh no, we need to, and me, myself, I feel like I need it to be perfect too. I'm like, my audio wasn't so good last time. I want to do so much better this time. What are your thoughts around that? Does it have to be perfect? Is there training required? Or can we just keep the DIY?
When people ask this, I turn it around and say, how many academics do you know who are actually great writers? Not so many, right? Some people really are. Some people can really write, and as well as think and teach and whatever else they need to do. But many people write in a real difficult to read style, which is fine if it's doing the job it's meant to do, which is to convey certain research or ideas, etc. So it's the same with podcasting. Sure, we are not going to sound like we are in a recording studio or a radio studio because we don't have access to that. But having said that, like, things are much better now, sounding better than what they used to. Personally, like, I've made some podcasts in the past which now would annoy me because there's such bad audio quality. But because it's like I was learning as I was doing it, and also people don't always listen to you. I mean, like I remember once I interviewed a guy for the New Books in South Asian Studies, so 7-8 years ago or something, and he turned on his laptop, and I'm like, okay, I think we were recording via Skype. It was so long ago. And he's just sitting in a cafe with no headphones. And I'm just like, so this is just going to be, it's just going to be useless. Crafted all the questions. We're sitting here and like, okay, so I did the interview because he was already like canceling and this and that. And then I was like, okay, so we did the interview and it's like, I'm not sure anyone's really going to listen to this because you just hear so much background noise and this and that and so on. So that's annoying. And I think listeners are becoming less forgiving because you can get a decent mic for a few €100, and if you're doing it like seriously, then I think you probably should, and then you should just think a little bit about your surroundings. Like I'm in like a relatively echoey room, so as you see, I put stuff up behind me. Just I have these like foam boards I just put around when I'm recording, just to make it sound much better. And like that's again just like little things that people can learn, the same way that we learn the craft of writing to a certain degree, as long as it's to make it to do its job. Same way I think we should do the same with audio. So I think we should take those aspects seriously, but that's only one aspect, and I think that's the one that people focus on, but I think it's actually not the most difficult, nor is it the most important. The most difficult and most important is working out how to translate ideas that we're used to working through in a textual form into an audio form, because we know, we have an abstract, we introduce an argument in a text, then we have our literature review or theoretical frame, then we have our data, then we have our analysis, whatever, right? Depends on your discipline, has different ways of doing it. That doesn't work for audio, right? What works for audio? So you've got to think, okay, what might this mean if I'm working with this medium? Where are people going to be listening to it? Maybe they're going to be listening to it on their bus or while they're cleaning the flat or whatever, walking their dog. And you need to then say, okay, so you need to think then about maybe not also only having like 45 minutes of talking, right? Same for lecturers, right? You wouldn't do a lecture like that, although some people do, but you shouldn't do a lecture like that because people can't concentrate. So you want to think about how you break it up. Then you might think, okay, maybe I'll get someone to voice up some quotes, or maybe I can use some sound effects, or maybe I can just have a little musical break, or whatever it is, depending on the topic and the discipline to start to work things out. And also, maybe you don't need to read things out. Maybe we can just talk and have a conversation with somebody, and it's not going to be perfect. There's going to be mistakes, and then you just have to learn, okay, that's fine with the medium, because it's a forgiving medium like that, because we're humans and people like podcasts, I think, scholarly podcasts, because we are humans who you can hear the human behind the scholarship or behind the scholar. And I think that's really, really something which is very key, because I think it has two dimensions. One is like a political one, because often people are unsure about who's producing knowledge, and a lot of people are attacking expert knowledge at the moment. And often I think that's because they can't hear people talk through, and can't hear people explain their missteps and their misturns and work and how they got to their conclusion. And the second thing is because they can hear emotion that we can't really show with writing very often. Unless you're a really, really good writer, you can't really convey emotion and feeling around a certain topic. But because we're used to speaking all the time, actually, we're quite good at doing that when we speak to people.
Yes. Thank you. That was really helpful. It touched on the technology and on the actual humanizing of the scholar, which is a theme that I see more and more with the interviewers. It brings the human back into the picture. We're not just, hidden behind these papers and paywalls. There's a human there. And we want our research to be heard too. And, you want to have that interaction with the communities or with the subject topics that you're talking about, that you're looking into, and hear what other people have to say. And then you can have a conversation and critique it together. On that note, going back to the critical podcasting methodology, how do you think this can help educational podcasting in the future? Do you see people picking it up? Or do we need a methodology? Can we just go with it? Can we just do what we've been doing?
I think it's going to be quite discipline specific. Like some disciplines work well with conversation. Philosophy works super well. That's why there's so many philosophy podcasts out there. Some disciplines work less well, like maths, right? I mean, although there is maths podcasts where, but that's usually people discuss more talking personally about why they get so excited about a certain thing or so on. And I think I like to think that anthropology, academia should actually it is one big long conversation with the authors who you read, with your students in your class, with your colleagues, with your peers who are researching similar themes at conferences and workshops and so on. And so podcasting can be a wonderful bridge between all these places, to make those conversations, to keep those to record those conversations for posterity, for analysis, for all of these things, and then to open up academia to people who aren't able to attend a class or attend a conference. If those conversations that are usually in those sorts of places are available, I think there's something quite good about that for the world. Sounds very utopian, but really, to really, it is fascinating that people want to. And I think this is what's been really wonderful about scholarly podcasting, is because you've seen that in the past, when you had the legacy media, there might be a bit of science somewhere in a show, 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever, in amongst the whatever. BBC used to do that, or maybe BBC Radio 4, which is sort of the highbrow BBC radio station. They might have a couple of shows a week, which like on social science or on natural science or whatever. But what podcasting has shown is that people really actually want to deep dive for a long time into a topic, and people are actually quite happy to listen to a 9-hour podcast, serial podcast, on the most obscure thing. And isn't that brilliant? And isn't that brilliant? Because we keep getting told that culture's dumbing us down, and etc. and so on. It's actually not true. It's actually a lot of demand for it amongst many people. Not so much about dialogue, but a little bit, because that is also pushing out the dialogue. And those podcasts that work well, I think, are ones that have the dialogue built into them. I mean, really popular history. I think the most popular history program now in the UK is sort of scholarly entertainment. It's called The Rest is History. I don't know if you know it. And it's a couple of historians who are talking different topics every single week, and in a very popular way. But what makes it, but they do touch on historiography as well from time to time. So it's not, and they're quite humble, but they're quite funny, and they obviously like each other, but they tease each other and they push each other. But because there's two of them, that's why it works very well, because they just ask the questions and
bounce
forward.
back then.
Yeah, bounce back and forth, rather than having somebody just talk for 45 minutes on a topic, which is very, very hard to follow. You have to be really good at speaking. So there are podcasts like that, and like another history podcast that's super popular is Hardcore History. I don't know if you know that one. Yeah, one of the original history podcasts, and that's by a former talk radio guy. So he's not a trained. Well, I think he's a master's in history, but he's just really, really good at speaking. And he doesn't have a script. He just talks, but he records them bit by bit because they last like 6 hours long or something.
Oh my goodness!
And he brings one out every like 6 months or something. So loads of research goes into it, and he just talks. And of course, there are mistakes in it and so on. So again, it's not being peer reviewed. It's not as rigorous as traditional scholarship, and I'm sure you probably wouldn't think of it as scholarship. It's more like popular history, but like there's still something amazing about it, and it's still something amazing. I think that people have such a thirst for that sort of knowledge. I think it's a good sign that we're not as dumb as people make out.
Yeah, it's a niche. You find that niche community, and they will sit there and they will listen, or they'll walk, whatever they may be doing in their day.
Isn't it
But
better
they
to
will
walk
listen.
and listen? Isn't it better to walk and listen than to sit?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know. I do. I like to walk and listen, or clean, like booting around the house, listening. It's interesting, and I feel like a lot of the students. So I TA for a course, Applications to Research Methods, and their final deliverable, they get to choose if they're going to do a podcast or if they're going to do a story map. So the podcast portion, the students that are solo researchers, so they don't have to be in groups, they can be solo as well, but they feel like they need to have a conversation. They're like, how do I have a conversation with myself? So I'm like, well, you can have a narrative. You can do like a reflection piece or a documentary style. You can throw in some different like news clips, news articles on your topic. But yeah, I feel like they're embracing the conversation. I guess if you are a good speaker, like you gave me some examples, they can just riff and still keep the audiences motivated to listen and engage.
Yeah, but that's an amazing skill, and plus a lot of prep has gone into it. The same way with a good conversational podcast, a lot of prep has gone into it.
Yes.
And so we talked about Material Girls before. I was just listening to, I can't remember which episode the other day, and what's funny about it as well is because sometimes they clearly show you that they've structured their conversation like in a funny way. They're like, so Hannah, I wondered if anyone has a theory that could help us understand, whatever Avatar or whatever they're talking about, or Gilmore Girls.
Yeah.
You mentioned that because actually, so of course, they make fun of it, by commenting through their irony. It means like a good conversation to listen to needs prep, right? It needs to be thought through. I mean, like hopefully people are enjoying this conversation because you've thought about the questions and you're not just like, this, but at the same time, what's really great about conversation, and especially academics sometimes struggle because sometimes they can be quite jittery and nervous, is the spontaneity of it, right? Is that you don't really know where the conversation is going until you start having it. Once you start having it, then new things emerge, and that's brilliant, I think.
Yeah, that's what I like about it. Like you said, one of my first interviews, I was so nervous. I'm like, oh my goodness, I have to read. I'm like reading my script. I'm like, no, it needs to be natural. And I'm like, why can't I just talk? But again, it takes practice. It takes time, just like crafting your writing, like you said. The audio, same thing. Interviewing is a skill that you need to learn as well, right? So all of these elements come together, and yeah, hopefully someone will listen. All right, so I think I'm gonna wrap up. I have 2 last questions. What are your hopes for academic podcast community in the future? What do you think is gonna happen? Do you think it's just gonna continue the way it's going? More people will pick it up?
So there's my hope, and there's what I think might happen, which is maybe less hopeful. So my hope is that really, I think like knowledge creation in academia is in a bad place. partly because people don't produce knowledge for the sake of producing knowledge or for any of a often wider purpose or goal for humanity or whatever. People just seem to be producing stuff to create journal articles in highly ranked journals that will get them points, that will get them cited, that will get them promotions, or get them prestige and get them prizes. Now, this is, just idiotic. I really think it's just idiotic. We just have to say it. And you can join in that race, of course. And I understand why people have to do it, because people need jobs. So it's not to critique the individuals who do it. It's the system that's a problem. And what I hope is that scholarly podcasting, sure, it's not a magic bullet, but because at the moment it hasn't been subsumed under these logics, it's a really nice space to produce knowledge. And some people, of course, think knowledge isn't being produced. But if you're interviewing people, you're analyzing all the stuff we talked about before, or we're discussing ideas, we're having new ideas, we're working stuff out like this. Yeah, sure, it's a different way of producing knowledge than the written word, but I think that it shows the different sorts of possibilities. And so this is the hope, right? That also the same like with the book we wrote, A Podcast or Perish, which is all about peer review. We show that when you ask this question, like, how do you peer review a podcast? A lot of people are like, you can't peer review a podcast because, it's not anonymous, and like peer review relies on anonymity. And it's like, well, actually, you know what? That's a relatively new thing. And actually, you know what? People abuse it all the time. And like, I don't know how many papers you put through traditional peer review, but like, it's not always a particularly nice process, because sometimes people use their anonymity to be nasty and to gatekeep, and not to help push knowledge forward. Because you can tell people, listen, I'm sorry, I don't think this should be published, in a nice way, but more often than not, it's done in a really mean-spirited way to somebody who spent like months working on something, and then like someone's just like, yeah, like just whatever. So then there are lots of new exciting ways that people are experimenting with peer review, so that it's better, not only just nicer, but actually better, that it does what it's meant to do. So that's the hope, that scholarly podcasting can improve knowledge creation and also create communities as well, which is super nice. I mean, like it's actually fun having written a book with Hannah and Laurie, and we've never met in our lives, but we had Zoom meetings every week for a year and a half to like produce it, and it's brought together through podcasting. But in general, the podcasts that people make in these quite niche things can be a way of creating new communities of scholars that don't always stick to pre-existing hierarchies, especially because it's younger people and more, how to say, edgy or interesting people. So that's there. Of course, the fear is that podcasting just goes the same way as everything else, that like it's just a thing that you should do. So back in the day when blogging was a thing, it was like every academic thought they had to have a blog, and then it stopped. And now every academic thinks they should have a podcast, and that would be a shame. It's like, no, you should only do it if you actually have a purpose of doing it, and you feel it's useful for whatever. Like it could be useful pedagogically to bring people into the ideas that you are exposed to in a university that people wouldn't otherwise had, or it could be political, like you want to whatever it is. So there's lots of reasons for it, but if it just becomes CV line creating, then yeah, I don't want to be part of that, like, to be honest. So it can go any way. It shows the possibilities. That's what I think. And I think, but the actual work of realizing those possibilities needs to go beyond just podcasting itself.
Thank you. Excellent. I have no words.
That's a good ending.
Thank you for taking the time out of your day to discuss academic podcast entanglements.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you.
All right.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Ian's take on podcasting as a methodology looks at giving back to the participants, to the community, looking at new cycles of knowledge production, destabilizing, crystallizing your thoughts and testing new ideas, doing analysis while editing, synthesizing, working with people. We can share our knowledge in many different phases of knowledge mobilization. However, be attentive to the craft. Thank you for tuning into the conversation about podcasting as a methodology. Our next episode will be a take on a similar theme with Laurie Beckstead. Ciao for now.